Your daughter will bind our borders, or she will bleed into them. Marcella's father didn't flinch when the Iron Oak emissary spoke those words. He simply nodded, as if trading livestock. Within 3 days, she was exiled from her own home, not as a bride, but as a hostage wrapped in silk and lies. They called it a marriage of peace. She called it what it was, a death with a ceremony attached. The Alpha King Sterling didn't believe in fated mates. He believed in bloodlines, conquest, and the absolute silence of submission. And she was being delivered to him like a treaty signed in her own blood. Before we go further, let's talk about what Marcella is actually facing, because this isn't just fantasy. Throughout human history, daughters of conquered or weakened kingdoms were sent as brides to secure peace treaties. But these weren't marriages of choice, they were political hostages. In medieval Europe, Asia, and even pre-colonial Africa, young women were used as living guarantees. If their birth families rebelled, the bride would be the first to die. These women lived in constant fear, isolated, stripped of their names, expected to bear heirs for men who saw them as property. Marcella is walking into that same trap. She has no power, no allies, and no illusions. Now, let's see what happens when the expendable refuse to disappear. The carriage stopped where the road ended. No ceremony, no escort beyond the tree line. Just Marcella, a trunk of dowry silks, and a stone cottage that looked carved from the mountain's bones. The driver's hands shook as he unloaded her belongings. You're to stay here until the purification rites are complete. 7 days, no visitors. The Alpha King will come when he's ready. And if I run? Marcella asked. His face went pale. The woods belong to the Iron Oak, miss. You wouldn't make it past the first ridge. He left without another word. The sound of hooves faded into vast, indifferent silence. The cottage was worse inside, stone walls sweating with dampness, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a single hearth with wet wood meant to smoke, not warm. No books, no tapestries, no distractions. This wasn't preparation for a wedding, this was isolation designed to break her. Marcella pressed her palm against the cold stone wall and let herself feel the full weight of what had happened. Her father had sold her, her brothers hadn't said goodbye, and the man she was being given to, Alpha King Sterling, was famous for his ruthlessness in battle, his contempt for weakness, and his absolute rejection of fated mate mythology. He didn't believe the goddess chose mates. He believed in strategy, and Marcella, she was strategy, a living contract, a womb with a pulse. Sterling was a conqueror, a tactician who had unified the Iron Oak territories through brilliant warfare and bone-deep terror. The common folk said his eyes were the color of winter seas, beautiful, cold, and capable of drowning you without remorse. When his first wife died in childbirth 2 years ago, he hadn't mourned publicly. He'd buried her in silence and never spoken her name again. Some said it was strength. Marcella thought it was cruelty. Marcella tried to sleep that first night, wrapped in her thickest cloak, pressed against the stone wall. The wind howled through the eaves, sounding too much like the widows she'd seen at her father's court, women whose husbands had died in Sterling's campaigns. She squeezed her eyes shut and tried to think of anything other than the reality waiting for her. But the wind wouldn't let her forget. It rattled the shutters. It whistled through cracks in the mortar. It sounded too much like crying. And then Marcella froze. It wasn't the wind. It was rhythmic, wet, hitching, a breath that didn't belong to hers. The sound was coming from under the bed. If you're already hooked, drop a wolf in the comments. And if you think Marcella should run while she still can, let me know, because what she's about to find under that bed will make running impossible. Marcella didn't move at first. She stayed frozen on her knees, her palms pressed flat against the cold floorboards, her breath shallow and careful. The whimpering continued, soft, broken, rhythmic. Each sound was wet, as if the creature beneath the bed was drowning in its own breath. She could run. She could pretend she hadn't heard anything. She could climb back onto the mattress and wait until morning, when the sound would either stop or someone else would deal with it. But she didn't, because she recognized that sound. It was the sound she'd made the night her father told her she was being sent away, the sound she'd swallowed down so no one would call her weak, the sound of something small and helpless realizing that no one was coming to save it. Marcella lowered herself onto her stomach, ignoring the splinters that bit into her elbows. She pressed her cheek to the wood and peered into the darkness under the bed. At first, there was nothing but shadow and the smell of damp stone. Then her eyes adjusted. A wolf pup. It was so small she could have held it in both hands. Its fur should have been silver gray, the color of moonlight on water, but it was matted with something darker, thick, congealed blood that had dried in streaks across its tiny body. Deep gashes cut through the fur on its face, crossing near its eyes and down its muzzle. One of its ears was torn, hanging at an angle that made Marcella's stomach twist. The pup's side rose and fell in shallow, shuddering jerks. Each breath sounded like it was being dragged through broken glass. And then it opened its eyes. They were clouded with pain, barely focused, but they found Marcella's face in the darkness. The pup didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It just looked at her with an expression that was far too human, far too knowing. Please. Marcella's breath caught. She didn't know if the word had been spoken aloud or if she'd simply felt it, a desperate, silent plea that resonated somewhere deep in her chest. "Oh, little one," she whispered, "what did they do to you?" The pup didn't answer, but its eyes stayed locked on hers, and in that moment, Marcella understood something fundamental about the world she'd been sent into. This place didn't just break the weak, it discarded them. It took the things that couldn't fight back and left them to die alone in the dark, under beds, in corners, where no one would have to see them suffer. She reached out slowly, her hand shaking. The pup flinched, its small body tensing as if expecting another blow. Marcella froze. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly. "I promise." The pup's breathing hitched, once, twice, and then it went still. For a terrible moment, Marcella thought it had died. But then she saw the faint rise and fall of its chest, slower now, weaker. It was giving up. "No," Marcella whispered, and the word came out sharper than she intended. "No, you don't get to do that. Not yet." She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know why it mattered. But right now, this pup wasn't dangerous. It was dying, and it was looking at her like she was the only thing standing between it and the darkness. Marcella made a decision. She didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about the laws of the Iron Oak Pack or the reputation of the man she was supposed to marry. She didn't think about what it would mean if someone found out. She just reached under the bed, wrapped her hands around the small, broken body of the pup, and pulled it into the light. What would you do if you found something dying that you weren't supposed to save? Comment heart if you'd risk it all, or comment run if you think Marcella just signed her own death warrant. The pup was heavier than she expected, its body limp and unresponsive in her arms. Blood smeared across her shift, warm and sticky against her skin. She could feel its heartbeat, fast, irregular, like a bird trapped in a cage. Marcella carried it to the table and laid it down as gently as she could. The pup whimpered, a sound so small and pitiful that it made her chest ache. That's when she saw the marks clearly. The gashes on the pup's face weren't accidental. They were deliberate, clean, precise cuts that had been made with a blade, not claws. And they formed a pattern, 3 parallel lines across the left side of its face, a ritual marking. Marcella had heard whispers about the iron oak laws during the journey here. The driver had muttered warnings to himself when he thought she wasn't listening, stories about the culling pits where weak or deformed pups were taken, stories about how only the strong were permitted to survive, how the pack's vitality depended on ruthless selection. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but the evidence was staring up at her from the table, bleeding through strips of her torn shift. This pup had been marked for death, and someone had carried out the sentence, or tried to. The realization hit her like a physical blow. If she saved this pup, she wasn't just breaking some minor rule. She was committing treason against the Iron Oak's most sacred law. She was harboring something that had been deemed unworthy of life. And if they found out, Marcella's hands started to shake. She looked at the door, then back at the pup. She could still undo this. She could carry it back outside, leave it in the woods, pretend she'd never seen it. No one would ever know. The pup's eyes opened again, clouded and unfocused, but somehow still watching her. "Damn it," Marcella whispered. She grabbed the clay basin, filled it with water from the pitcher, and brought it back to the table. Her hands were steadier now, driven by something that felt like anger but burned hotter. She tore another strip from her shift and dipped it in the water. The pup flinched when she touched the cloth to its wounds, letting out a sharp yelp that cut through the silence. Marcella's chest tightened, but she didn't stop. "I know it hurts," she whispered, "but if I don't clean these, you're going to die. And I can't—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I can't let that happen." She worked through the night, cleaning each wound with methodical care. The pup cried out each time she touched a particularly deep gash, and every sound felt like a blade twisting in her own chest. But she kept going, kept pressing the cloth to torn flesh, kept washing away the evidence of what had been done to this small, helpless creature. When the wounds were as clean as she could get them, she realized she had nothing to bind them with. No bandages, no salve, nothing that could stop the bleeding if it started again. She looked at her trunk in the corner, filled with the silks and fine fabrics her father had given her as part of her dowry. Those gowns were supposed to be her future. They were supposed to make her beautiful, desirable, worthy of a king's attention. Marcella walked to the trunk and pulled out the finest gown she owned, a deep blue silk embroidered with silver thread, the kind of dress she'd imagined wearing on her wedding night. She didn't hesitate. She tore the fabric into strips, ripping through the silk with her bare hands. The sound was sharp and satisfying, like breaking chains. When she wrapped the silk around the pup's wounds, the blue fabric turned dark with blood almost immediately. But she kept wrapping, kept working until every gash was covered. The pup watched her the entire time with those clouded, knowing eyes. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie the final knot. She sank into the chair beside the table and looked at what she'd done. The pup was still breathing, shallow but steady. The bleeding had stopped. It wasn't going to die, not tonight. But Marcella knew with absolute certainty that she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross. She reached out and placed her hand gently on the pup's small head. Its fur was matted and sticky with blood, but underneath she could feel warmth. Life. I don't know what's going to happen when they find you. I don't know if I can protect you, but I'm not going to let you die alone. Do you understand? You're not alone anymore. The pup's breathing seemed to steady at her touch. Its eyes drifted closed, and for the first time since she'd found it, it looked almost peaceful. Marcella stayed there through the rest of the night, her hand on the pup's head, watching it breathe. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Every sound from outside, every crack of a branch, every distant howl made her heart race with the certainty that someone was coming. But no one came. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters, Marcella heard something that made her blood turn to ice. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, getting closer. The Alpha King had arrived. Marcella barely had time to move. She scooped the pup off the table and looked around the cottage in panic. There was nowhere to hide him. The space was too small, too bare. The bed? She could put him back under the bed, but the floorboards were stained with blood now, and the smell. The door opened. No knock, no warning, just the sudden flood of cold morning air and a presence so overwhelming that Marcella felt it before she even saw him. Alpha King Sterling filled the doorway like a storm about to break. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader, draped in furs that made him look even more massive, his shoulders blocking out the pale dawn light behind him. His hair was dark, pulled back from a face that could have been carved from stone, all hard angles and brutal symmetry. And his eyes were exactly what they'd said, the color of winter seas, cold, depthless, capable of drowning you without remorse. Those eyes swept the room in one practiced motion, taking in everything: the torn strips of silk on the floor, the basin of bloodied water, the state of Marcella's shift, stained and ruined. And then they locked onto her face. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The pup was still cradled in her arms, hidden partially by the fabric of her cloak, but she could feel its tiny heartbeat racing against her chest. Sterling took one step inside, then another. He moved with the kind of deliberate control that made every movement feel like a threat. "You were to remain in purification," he said. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls. "No contact, no distractions, no—" He stopped mid-sentence, his nostrils flaring. Marcella's heart slammed against her ribs. "You smell of blood, Marcella." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of absolute certainty. Her voice came out too high, too thin. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I cut my hand on the crates when I was unpacking." She held up her hand, showing him the bandages she'd hastily wrapped around her fingers before he arrived. It was a weak lie. She knew it. He knew it. Sterling's gaze dropped to her bandaged hand, then moved slowly back up to her face. He didn't blink, didn't move, just watched her with the kind of intensity that made her feel like he was peeling back her skin to see what was underneath. "Show me." "What?" "Your hand. Show me the wound." Marcella's mind raced. She couldn't. The moment she unwrapped the bandages, he'd see that there was nothing there, or worse, that the blood wasn't even hers. It's not proper for you to—" "I am your alpha," Sterling interrupted, his voice dropping even lower. "Your king, your future mate. There is nothing about you that will remain private from me. Now show me your hand, or I will take it from you." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Marcella's grip tightened on the pup hidden beneath her cloak. She could feel it trembling. Whether from fear or pain, she didn't know, but she knew that if Sterling took one more step closer, if he reached for her hand, he would feel the warmth of the pup against her body, and then it would be over. "A queen of the iron oak does not bleed so easily," Sterling said, taking another step. He was close enough now that she could smell him, pine and smoke and something wild that made her instincts scream at her to run. "And she does not smell of the discarded." Marcella's breath caught. The discarded. That's what he called them. The pups that were cold, the weak, the unworthy. Sterling's gaze shifted, moving past her to the table, to the strips of torn silk, to the basin, and then, slowly, inevitably, toward the bed. "Where is it?" he asked, and this time his voice was utterly emotionless. "I don't know what you—" "Do not lie to me again." Sterling's eyes snapped back to hers, and for the first time, Marcella saw something beneath the ice. Not anger, something colder than anger. Certainty. "I can smell it. I can hear its heartbeat. You have brought something into this place that was meant to die. So I will ask you one more time, and I suggest you answer with truth. Where is it?" The pup whimpered against her chest, so quietly that a human wouldn't have heard it. But Sterling wasn't human. His gaze dropped to her cloak, to the barely perceptible bulge hidden beneath the fabric, and Marcella knew with absolute clarity that there was no more hiding. The Alpha King had found them both. The door exploded inward before Marcella could speak. A man stormed through, dragging a young village girl by her hair. The girl was sobbing, her feet barely touching the ground as she struggled against his grip. Behind them, 2 more guards filled the doorway, their faces hard and impassive. The man who'd entered was almost as large as Sterling, but where the Alpha King moved with controlled precision, this man radiated barely contained violence. His face was a map of old scars, and his eyes gleamed with something that looked like triumph. "My lord," the man said, his voice sharp with satisfaction. He threw the girl to the floor at Sterling's feet. "I apologize for the interruption, but this matter could not wait." Sterling's expression didn't change. He didn't even look at the girl. His gaze remained fixed on Marcella, on the cloak she held clutched against her chest. "Silas," Sterling said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you were ordered to remain at the compound." "Yes, my lord, but this girl—" Silas kicked the sobbing woman, not hard enough to injure but enough to make her cry out, "was seen near the cottage last night, carrying water to the shed." Marcella's blood turned to ice. "She claims," Silas continued, his lips pulling back in something that wasn't quite a smile, "that she heard the lady speaking to something that whimpered." Sterling's gaze finally shifted from Marcella to Silas, and the healers reported this morning that one of the marked whelps is missing from the culling pits. A male pup, silver-gray fur, marked 3 days ago for the feral sleep sickness. Silas's eyes moved to Marcella, and she saw naked hatred there. "It seems your bride has developed unfortunate sympathies." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sterling turned back to Marcella. His face was utterly blank, which somehow made him more terrifying than if he'd been raging. "Show me," he said. It wasn't a request. Marcella's arms tightened around the pup. She could feel it trembling against her, could feel its tiny heart racing so fast that it seemed impossible that such a small chest could contain it. "He's just a baby," she whispered. "Show me." There was no point in hiding anymore. Slowly, Marcella opened her cloak. The pup lay cradled in her arms, wrapped in strips of blue silk that were dark with dried blood. The ritual markings on its face were clearly visible now, 3 parallel cuts that identified it as condemned. Its eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow, but it was alive. Silas's laugh was sharp and cruel. "There it is, the rot she's brought into your house, my lord. That thing carries the feral sleep. If it lives, it will infect the entire pack, turn them into mindless beasts. You know the law." Sterling stared at the pup for a long moment. Marcella couldn't read his expression, couldn't tell if she saw disgust or calculation or something else entirely. "The law is clear," Sterling said, his voice flat, emotionless. "Marked pups are returned to the earth, no exceptions." "No," Marcella said, and the word came out stronger than she expected. "He's not sick. Look at him. These wounds, they're not from a disease. Someone did this to him. Someone cut him and left him to die." "Because he is weak," Silas spat. "Because he is defective. Because allowing him to live would poison the bloodline." "He's a child." "It is a mutation, and I will finish what should have been done 3 days ago." Marcella stumbled backward, putting the table between herself and Silas. The pup whimpered in her arms, and she held it tighter.
Sterling held up one hand. Silas stopped immediately, but his grip on the dagger didn't loosen. "Silas," Sterling said, his voice so cold it made her shiver. "You were sent here as a bride of peace, to bind our territories, to prove that your house understands the cost of loyalty." He took a step toward her. "By harboring this creature, you have committed treason against the Iron Oak. You have violated our most sacred law. You have proven yourself unworthy of the title you were meant to carry." Each word landed like a physical blow. "I chose you because your father said you were compliant, obedient, that you understood your place." His eyes, those winter sea eyes, bored into hers. "I did not choose you to bring rot into my house." "Then you chose wrong," Marcella said, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "Because I will not stand by and watch you murder a helpless child. I don't care what your laws say. I don't care what you think strength is. This is wrong." For the first time, something flickered across Sterling's face. Surprise, maybe, or anger. "Wrong?" he repeated slowly. "You speak to me of wrong? You who have been here less than a day. You who know nothing of what we have sacrificed to keep this pack alive. I know enough. I know that any kingdom built on the corpses of children is not a kingdom worth serving." Silas snarled. "You dare? Enough." Sterling's voice cracked like a whip. The entire room went silent. He moved toward Marcella with slow, deliberate steps. She backed against the wall, the pup clutched to her chest, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. "Sterling," said the pup in his low and terrible voice, "that pup carries the mark of death. It must be burned. And you," his hand came up, not to strike but to grip her throat, not hard enough to choke but firm enough to control, to make her understand exactly how powerless she was. He turned his head toward Silas. "Finish it." Silas's smile was vicious as he stepped forward, silver dagger gleaming in the dim morning light. And that's when the pup spoke.
Silas moved toward the table, where Marcella had backed herself against the wall, his dagger raised. The pup's breathing quickened, each tiny gasp filled with terror. Marcella turned her body to shield it, pressing it against her chest, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sterling stood watching, his face carved from stone. His hand was still on Marcella's throat, not hurting, but holding, controlling, making her witness what her mercy had cost. Silas reached for the pup. And then, the sound that filled the cottage wasn't a whimper, it wasn't a cry, it was a voice. "Father, please." The word didn't come from the pup's mouth, it came from inside their minds, a psychic wail that crashed through the room like a wave, desperate and pleading and utterly, impossibly human. Silas froze mid-reach, his face going white. Marcella gasped, her arms tightening around the pup. And Sterling? Sterling recoiled as if he'd been struck. The hand on Marcella's throat fell away. He stumbled backward, his eyes wide, his expression fracturing into something she hadn't thought him capable of. Shock. Raw, unfiltered shock. "No," Sterling breathed. The pup whimpered again, and this time the telepathic voice was weaker, more fragile. "Father, it hurts. Please don't let him." Marcella looked down at the small creature in her arms, then back at Sterling. His face had gone ashen. His hands, those massive warrior's hands that had gripped her throat moments ago, were shaking. "That's not possible," Sterling said, but his voice had no strength behind it. "He's dead. My son is dead. He was—" He stopped, his breath coming faster. "Silas told me he was stillborn." Silas's face twisted. "My lord, this is a trick, some kind of—" "Look at him!" Sterling roared, and the sound was so powerful that dust fell from the rafters. He strode toward Marcella, not threatening now, but desperate. "Let me see him. Let me—"
Marcella shifted slightly, angling the pup so Sterling could see its face clearly, the ritual markings, the torn ear, the silver-gray fur matted with blood. And then Sterling saw what Marcella hadn't noticed in the dark. On the pup's left ear, barely visible beneath the blood and matted fur, was a small marking, not a scar, a birthmark, silver against gray, shaped like a crescent moon. Sterling's breathing stopped. His hand came up slowly, trembling, and he touched his own left hand, where a signet ring sat, carved with the same crescent moon symbol. "The iron oak mark," Sterling whispered. "He bears the iron oak mark." The pup's clouded eyes opened, focusing on Sterling's face, and this time the telepathic voice was clear enough that even Marcella heard it in her mind. "Father, I waited for you to come back." Sterling dropped to his knees. The sound he made wasn't human. It was the sound of something breaking deep inside a man who had built himself from stone and ice, a man who had buried his heart so deep he thought it was gone. "Farron, my son, my son." Silas backed toward the door, his dagger still in his hand, his face a mask of calculated panic. "My lord, you don't understand. The boy was weak. He was born with a limp, with a soft heart. I did what was necessary to—" "You told me he was dead." Sterling's voice was quiet now, deadly quiet. "You held my dying mate's hand and told me our son had not survived the birth. You let me bury an empty cradle." "Because he was not fit to rule," Silas shouted, and all pretense of loyalty shattered. "Look at him. He's small, damaged. He would have made the pack weak. I was protecting your legacy. I was protecting the Iron Oak line." Sterling rose to his feet slowly. Marcella had seen him angry before, in the stories, in the reputation that preceded him, but this was something beyond anger. This was wrath. "You took my son from me," he said, each word precise and cold. "You let him mourn a child who was alive. You let him suffer in the culling pits, while I—" He broke, just for a moment. "While I burned his empty cradle and swore never to feel that pain again." "I did it for you," Silas's voice rose in desperation. "For the pack. The Iron Oak cannot be ruled by weakness. You know this. You built this kingdom on strength." "I built this kingdom," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "so my children would not have to." The silence that followed was absolute. Marcella held the pup closer, feeling his tiny heartbeat against her chest. The small voice in her mind whispered again, weaker now. "Father, I'm sorry I'm not strong enough." Sterling's eyes closed. When they opened again, they were wet. "You are my son," and his voice cracked with something Marcella had never expected to hear from him. Grief, love, regret. "You are strong enough."
Silas's face twisted into something ugly as Sterling moved toward him. The beta raised his dagger, but his hand was shaking now, not with fear, but with rage. "You're making a mistake," Silas said, his voice sharp. "That creature is weak, defective. If you let him live, if you show mercy to something the pack has already condemned, they will see you as soft. They will see the Iron Oak as broken." "The only thing broken here," Sterling said, his voice deadly calm, "is you." Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think this is about one pup? You fool. I've been protecting the bloodline for years. Every weak child, every deformed whelp, every pup born with the wrong color eyes, the wrong temperament, the wrong—" he gestured violently toward Theron, "the wrong everything. I've been culling them while you were away at war. I've been keeping the Iron Oak pure while you chased glory on the battlefield." Marcella felt sick. "How many?" she whispered. "How many children did you kill?"
Silas turned his hate-filled gaze on her. Dozens, maybe more. I stopped counting after the first year. He looked back at Sterling. And the pack is stronger for it. You know I'm right. You built this kingdom on the principle that only the strong survive. I simply enforced it. You twisted it, Sterling said. You turned survival into slaughter. You murdered children and called it duty. I did what you were too weak to do. Silas's voice rose to a shout. You talk about strength, but you flinched from the hard choices. You wanted a pure bloodline, but you wouldn't do what was necessary to maintain it. So I did it for you, and I positioned myself as your only heir because I knew that eventually you'd fail, you'd show mercy, you'd go soft. He pointed the dagger at Sterling. And now you have. That thing in her arms should have died 2 years ago. If you acknowledge him, if you let him live, the pack will see it as weakness. They'll see you as unfit, and they'll follow me instead. Sterling took another step forward. Is that a threat, Silas? It's a promise. Silas whistled, sharp, high, commanding. The guards who'd been standing silently by the door moved into the room. Not 2, 4, then 6, all armed, all watching Sterling with expressions that were no longer loyal. Marcella's breath caught. These weren't just Silas's personal guards. These were pack warriors, men who should have died for their alpha, but they were standing with Silas. So you see, Silas said, and now his confidence was returning. I've been preparing for this moment for years, building loyalty, making promises, showing them that the future of the Iron Oak lies with strength, not sentiment. He gestured to Sterling. You came here unarmed, unguarded, because you were meeting your bride. He spat the word like poison. You didn't think you'd need protection. That was your mistake. Sterling looked at the guards surrounding him. His face was still calm, but Marcella could see the calculation behind his eyes. He was out-counting opponents, measuring distances, assessing odds. He was outnumbered, unarmed, and positioned between Marcella, his son, and 6 blades. You think strength is measured by the absence of scars, Silas? Sterling asked quietly. I think strength is measured by results, Silas shot back. And the result here is clear. You're finished. The pack will follow me. And that, he pointed at Theron, will die, along with the woman stupid enough to save it. The guards moved closer, forming a tightening circle. Marcella pressed herself against the wall. Theron clutched to her chest. The pup was shaking. Whether from pain or fear, she couldn't tell. Sterling stood in the center of the room, surrounded, his massive frame tense but controlled. I have led this pack through a decade of winter. I have lost brothers and limbs. I have broken my body on the battlefield so that the Iron Oak would survive. My strength didn't come from being perfect. It came from surviving the breaking. Pretty words, Silas sneered. They won't stop steel. The first guard lunged. Sterling moved like lightning. He caught the man's wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into the table with enough force to splinter wood. The second guard swung a sword towards Sterling's head. Sterling ducked, came up under the guard, and drove his elbow into the warrior's throat. The man went down, choking. But there were 4 more. They came at him together, coordinated, trained. Sterling fought like a man possessed, every movement economical, brutal, effective. But he was unarmed, and there were too many. A blade caught him across the shoulder. He grunted, blood spattering across the stone floor, but didn't slow. Another blade slashed his thigh. He went down on one knee. Marcella screamed, "Stop, please!" But they didn't stop. Silas stood back, watching, his smile growing wider as Sterling took another hit. Another. Blood was pooling on the floor now. Sterling was still fighting, still moving, but he was slowing. He was going to die. Marcella looked down at Theron. The pup's eyes were open, fixed on Sterling, on his father falling under the weight of men who had betrayed him. And then Theron spoke again. Not to her, not to Sterling, to something else. Comment rise if you know what's about to happen, because the thing they called weak is about to show them the true meaning of power.
Sterling caught the next blade with his bare hand. Blood streamed between his fingers as the edge bit deep into his palm, but he didn't let go. He twisted the sword away from the guard's grip and drove his fist into the man's jaw. The warrior crumpled. But there were still 3 more, and Sterling was bleeding from too many wounds now: shoulder, thigh, hand, a gash across his ribs that made his breathing ragged. He stumbled, caught himself against the wall. His eyes found Marcella's across the room, and in that moment she saw something she'd never expected to see in the Alpha King's face. Fear. Not for himself, for them. "Run," Sterling rasped, blood on his lips. "Take him and run." "Where?" Marcella's voice broke. "You said the woods belonged to the Iron Oak. You said I wouldn't make it past the first ridge." A guard swung at Sterling's head. He ducked, but not fast enough. The pommel of the sword caught him across the temple. He went down hard, crashing to his knees, blood pouring from the wound. "No!" Marcella screamed. Silas stepped forward, his dagger gleaming. "This is how it ends, Sterling. Not on a battlefield, not in glory, but here, in this pathetic cottage, betrayed by your own weakness." He moved towards Sterling, raising the blade. "And when I'm done with you, I'll finish what I started with that thing she's holding." Sterling tried to rise, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He looked up at Silas, and even now, bleeding, beaten, dying, there was defiance in his eyes. "You were never strong enough to lead," Sterling said quietly. "That's why you needed to kill children, because you knew that even a wounded pup had more courage than you ever would." Silas's face twisted with rage. "Die knowing you failed." He drove the dagger down. Sterling raised his arm to block it, but he was too low, too weak, too... Theron screamed. Not with his voice, with his mind. The sound that erupted from the tiny pup was unlike anything Marcella had ever experienced. It wasn't telepathy. It wasn't a cry. It was a psychic shockwave that exploded outward from Theron's small body, like a detonation, crashing through the cottage with enough force to shake the stone walls. Every person in the room froze. Silas's dagger stopped inches from Sterling's chest, held suspended by something invisible. The guards fell to their knees, their hands pressed to their heads, their faces contorted in pain. Even Sterling gasped, his eyes going wide. But Marcella felt nothing but warmth. She looked down at Theron in her arms. The pup's eyes were open now, fully open, and they weren't clouded anymore. They glowed with a pale, ethereal light, silver and gold threaded together, ancient and terrible and beautiful. His fur was changing. The matted, blood-soaked gray was being consumed by that same ethereal glow, spreading across his small body like dawn breaking over water. The wounds on his face, the ritual marks that condemned him, began to close, the torn flesh knitting together before her eyes. "What?" Marcella breathed. Theron's voice filled her mind, but it was different now. Stronger, deeper, resonant with power that should not exist in something so small. "They called me weak. They called me cursed. They marked me for death because I was born different." The light grew brighter, spreading beyond Theron's body, filling the cottage with a radiance that hurt to look at. "But I am not cursed. I am ancient." The guards were screaming now. Not in pain, but in terror. The psychic pressure Theron was emanating wasn't hurting them, it was showing them something, forcing them to see. Marcella caught fragments of it, images bleeding through the edges of her mind. Children in pits, small bodies marked with ritual cuts, tiny voices crying out for mothers who would never come. Years of systematic murder hidden behind the word necessary. Silas was on his knees now, his dagger fallen from his hand. His face had gone white, his eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. "Stop," one of the guards whimpered. "Please, make it stop." Theron's voice was gentle when it came, but implacable.
You need to see what you've done. You need to understand what you destroyed." Sterling had pulled himself to his feet, one hand pressed against the gash on his ribs. He was staring at his son with an expression Marcella couldn't name. Awe mixed with grief, mixed with something that looked like pride. An ancient. The last one was born 300 years ago. We thought the bloodline was extinct. "What does that mean?" Marcella asked, her arms still wrapped protectively around Theron, even though she could feel the power radiating from him now. "It means," Sterling said, his voice rough with emotion, "that my son isn't weak. He isn't cursed. He's the rarest gift the goddess has given the Iron Oak in generations." He looked at Silas, still frozen on his knees. "And you tried to kill him." The light around Theron began to recede, pulling back into his small body. The psychic pressure eased, and the guards collapsed fully to the floor, gasping and sobbing. But Silas remained kneeling, his face blank, his mind somewhere far away. Theron's voice was weaker now, the effort of what he'd done clearly exhausting him. "I didn't want to hurt them. I just wanted them to understand, to see." "You showed them mercy," Sella said softly, stroking the pup's head. His fur was still glowing faintly, but the wounds were completely healed now, even after everything they've done. "Father always said strength is surviving the breaking. I survived, but I don't want to become what broke me." Sterling made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He crossed the room in 3 staggering steps and dropped to his knees beside Marcella. His hand, massive, scarred, still bleeding, reached out hesitantly toward Theron. "May I?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the words. Marcella looked down at Theron. The pup's glowing eyes met hers, and she felt his silent question. "Is he safe? Can I trust him?" "Yes," Marcella said firmly. "He's your father, and he's been looking for you." Carefully, reverently, Sterling took his son into his arms. The massive warrior and the tiny pup, both broken, both bleeding, both somehow still alive. "I'm sorry," Sterling whispered against Theron's fur. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I believed the lies. I'm sorry you had to suffer because I was too blind to see the truth. You came back. That's what matters. You came back for me." Sterling's shoulders shook. Marcella realized with a start that the Alpha King was crying, silent tears streaming down his blood-streaked face as he held the son he'd thought he'd lost. Around them, the guards were pulling themselves together, their faces ashen. They looked at Theron with a mixture of terror and reverence. Whatever they'd seen in that psychic vision had changed something fundamental in them. Only Silas remained motionless, kneeling on the floor, his eyes vacant. "What did you do to him?" Sterling asked, his voice rough. Theron's response was quiet, almost sad. "I showed him every child he killed, every life he ended, every future he destroyed. I made him feel what they felt. Will he recover? Eventually, but he'll never forget. He'll carry them with him forever." Sterling looked at his former beta with an expression that held no pity. "Good."
The sun was fully risen by the time Sterling stood, still cradling Theron in his arms. The cottage that had been a place of isolation and fear hours ago now felt different, sacred somehow, as if something fundamental had shifted within its stone walls. The guards who had attacked Sterling were kneeling now, not in obedience, but in genuine remorse. One of them, a young warrior with a fresh scar across his jaw, spoke first. "My lord, we didn't know. Silas told us the cullings were necessary, that weakness would destroy the pack. We believed him." "Believing a lie doesn't erase what you've done," Sterling said. His voice was hard, but not cruel. "You participated in the murder of children. That stain doesn't wash away with apologies." "Then what would you have us do?" another guard asked, his voice breaking. Sterling looked down at Theron, still glowing faintly in his arms. Then he looked at Silas, still kneeling, still trapped in the prison of his own making. "You will serve," Sterling said, finally. "All of you. You will go to the culling pits, and you will find every child that Silas marked for death, every pup that was deemed too weak, too different, too imperfect, and you will bring them home. You will care for them. You will protect them. You will spend the rest of your lives proving that the iron oak is more than what Silas made it." The guards stared at him, then slowly nodded. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was purpose. "And Silas?" one of them asked. Sterling's expression hardened. "Silas will join you. He will serve in the pits he created. He will care for the children he tried to destroy. He will see their faces every day and remember what he did. He will not die for his crimes. Death would be mercy. Instead, he will live, and he will atone." It was a sentence more terrible than execution. To spend your life surrounded by the evidence of your cruelty, caring for the very ones you had condemned. Poetic justice. Sterling turned to Marcella then. She was still standing against the wall, blood-stained and exhausted, her shift torn and her hands shaking. She had expected him to be angry with her for interfering, for breaking his laws, for... He knelt. The Alpha King, still bleeding from multiple wounds, still cradling his son, lowered himself to one knee before her. "Marcella," he said, and his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I came to this cottage expecting to collect a bride I had chosen for political convenience, a woman I believed would be compliant, obedient, easy to control." He looked up at her, and his winter sea eyes were no longer cold. "Instead, I found someone who saw worth where I saw weakness, who chose mercy when I demanded cruelty, who saved my son when I had already buried him." Marcella's throat tightened. "I only did what anyone should have done." "No," Sterling said, firmly. "You did what almost no one would have had the courage to do. You risked everything, your safety, your future, your life for a creature you had no reason to care about. You broke our laws not because you didn't understand them, but because you understood that some laws deserve to be broken." He reached out with his free hand and took hers. "I spent my life building a kingdom of stone and iron. I thought that was strength. I thought that was what it meant to protect my people." His voice broke slightly. "But stone breaks and iron rusts. It is the heart that endures." Tears streamed down Marcella's face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that you are not a hostage. You were never a hostage." Sterling's grip on her hand tightened. "You are the heart of the iron oak, the conscience I forgot I needed, the strength I was too blind to recognize." He looked at Theron, then back at her. "And if you will have us, both of us, I would be honored to call you my mate. Not because a treaty demands it, but because I choose you, because my son chose you first." Theron's voice entered her mind, warm and gentle. "Will you stay? Will you be my mother?" Marcella's knees gave out. She sank down beside Sterling, her hand still in his, and touched Theron's soft head. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." Sterling pulled her close, careful of Theron between them, and pressed his forehead to hers. "Then we rebuild, together. No more cullings, no more sacrificing the vulnerable for the illusion of strength. The iron oak will be what it should have been from the beginning, a place where every life matters." Marcella looked at the cottage around them, at the blood on the floor and the broken furniture and the strips of her wedding gown that had saved a dying pup's life. "This place," she said softly, "this cottage they sent me to, it wasn't a prison after all." "No," Sterling agreed, "it was the birthplace of everything that comes next." And as the morning light streamed through the cracks in the shutters, illuminating the three of them, broken, bleeding, but alive,
Marcella understood the truth she'd learned in the darkest hours of that first terrible night. True strength was not the absence of weakness, it was the compassion to protect it. The things society discarded were often the very things destined to save it. And mercy, even when it cost everything, was always worth the price. If this story touched your heart, drop a heart below. Share it with someone who needs to hear that being kind isn't weakness, it's the bravest thing you can do. And remember, sometimes the things the world calls worthless are the very things that change everything.